The last transmission from Kepler Station came in at 03:07 hours Galactic Standard Time. It lasted 11 seconds. No distress code, no encoded warning, no dignified last words from a commander choosing death over capture. Just the raw, unfiltered audio feed of a military outpost being torn apart. The groan of pressurized steel buckling inward. The sharp crack of something enormous moving through corridors built for creatures a third its size. And then, buried beneath the static and the dying hum of failing power cores, a single human voice. Not screaming, laughing. Admiral Keth Varun of the Sovereignty Fleet stood before the holographic replay table in the war room, aboard his flagship, the Unbroken Dominion, and listened to that laugh for the 47th time. He had catalogued every known sound a human made when facing death. He had studied their psychology, their fear responses, their documented breaking points. He had spent 60 years prosecuting a war against Earth's colonies, burning them to slag, salting their orbital lanes with debris, watching their pathetic defense fleets scatter like insects before a torch. Humans ran, humans hid, humans begged. This human was laughing. "Play it again," he said. His tactical officer, Sub-Commander Drine, hesitated. A small thing, barely perceptible, a half-second pause before the compliance chirp. Varun noticed. He noticed everything. The 11 seconds filled the war room again. Around the holographic table stood the 7 greatest military minds the Sovereignty had ever produced. 12 combined centuries of warfare. They had raised the Pelori homeworld in a single afternoon. They had collapsed the Veth Collective into surrender in under a decade. They had systematically dismantled every attempt humanity had made to organize into a coherent fighting force over the past century, cutting their supply lines, destroying their shipyards, assassinating their admirals before their names could become symbols. The Sovereignty had been meticulous, it had been thorough, and yet, Kepler Station was gone. Not captured, not occupied, gone. 17,000 tons of hardened military installation, dug 3 kilometers into a moon's crust, reinforced with siege-grade plating capable of withstanding sustained orbital bombardment, gone. The reconnaissance drones had returned footage of a crater so clean, so perfectly geometrical, that 3 of Varun's own engineers had initially classified it as a natural formation before someone noticed the human boot print in the scorched rock at the crater's lip. One boot print, pointed away from the crater, walking. "Sir," Drine again, that hesitation. "The perimeter watchposts, stations 7, 12, and 19 have gone dark in the last 2 hours. Varun turned slowly. Dark? No distress signal, no system failure alert, no debris field. They simply stopped transmitting. The war room was silent except for the soft, persistent hum of the flagship's drives. For 112 years humanity had been losing this war. They had lost it brilliantly, desperately, heroically. But they had been losing. The mathematics were simple. The Sovereignty outnumbered them 40-1. Their technology was superior across every measurable metric. Their industrial capacity could produce a new warship in the time it took a human colony to repair a damaged one. Earth's government had fractured under the pressure decades ago. Their colonies had been cut off from each other, isolated, picked apart one by one in a strategy so coldly efficient that military historians across the galaxy had written admiring analyses of it. Varun had won this war. He had won it completely. So why in the last 90 days had 47 Sovereignty military installations simply ceased to exist? No declarations, no ultimatums, no patterns his analysts could map, no enemy fleet on any scanner. They had lost 47 installations to something that left behind boot prints and laughter, and nothing else. Drine leaned in close, voice low. "Sir, intelligence has a preliminary report. They believe—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "They believe the humans have deployed a new type of unit, soldiers unlike anything in their previous force structure." Varun stared at the crater on the holographic display. "What kind of soldiers?" he asked. Drine placed a secondary file on the table. It contained 17 surveillance images, each one pulled from a Sovereignty installation in its final moments. Grainy, motion blurred, partial, Every single image showed the same thing: a human figure, moving through fire, through wreckage, through vacuum, through crossfire so thick it should have been physically impossible to walk through and remain intact, moving like they belonged there, not running, not taking cover, not hesitating, advancing. Faroon had not felt fear in 40 years of war. He had felt calculation and patience, and the clean, cold satisfaction of superior strategy executing itself perfectly. What he felt now, looking at those 17 images, was something he did not have a word for. 3 stations went dark while he was standing there. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, humans were coming, and they were not coming to negotiate. It had started, as most irreversible things do, with a decision made by exhausted people in a small room with bad lighting. The room was located in the lowest sublevel of the Ganymede Resistance Council's headquarters, a facility that had changed locations 41 times in the past decade, always one step ahead of sovereignty intelligence, existing in a permanent state of barely controlled panic. The people inside it had not slept properly in months. Several of them had not eaten a full meal in longer than that. All of them had lost someone. Director Mara Voss sat at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her, scientists, soldiers, engineers, philosophers, and said the thing that none of them had been willing to say out loud yet. We cannot win this war the way we've been fighting it. No one argued. That was the worst part. A year ago there would have been arguments, passionate ones, principled ones, the kind that meant people still believed in the shape of the thing they were fighting for. Now there was just silence, and the hum of recycled air and the knowledge, shared and unspoken, that humanity had maybe 18 months left before the sovereignty's tightening net caught the last of the organized resistance. We cannot match them in numbers, Voss continued. We cannot match them in production capacity. We cannot match them in conventional military technology. We have tried brilliantly, and we have been losing brilliantly, and it has to stop. She pulled up a file. 300 pages. 7 years of work by the most controversial research team in what remained of the human military apparatus, a team that had been shut down twice, defunded 3 times, and officially classified as ethically non-compliant by 2 separate oversight committees. Project Fenrir, she said. We're reopening it. All of it. No restrictions. The room erupted. For 10 minutes there was argument. Real argument. The kind that meant people still believed in something. Ethical boundaries. The laws they'd built into their own charter. The question of what kind of humanity they were fighting to preserve if they did this to their own people. Voss let it run. Then she placed a second file on the table. Casualty reports from the last 30 days. Colony by colony. Installation by installation. Names. The room went quiet again. We are not making weapons, she said. We are making survivors. We are taking the people who have already survived things that should have killed them, and we are asking them, not conscripting, whether they would like to be something the sovereignty has no framework for. The vote was 6-1. Project Fenrir was reopened the next morning. The volunteers were called Echoes, for reasons that became obvious to anyone who spent time with them. Because when they moved through a space, you felt it before you heard it. An alteration in the air, a pressure shift, something ancient in the lizard brain architecture of the human nervous system saying, apex predator, do not move. They were not super soldiers in the science fiction sense. There were no cybernetic limbs, no neural combat processors, no genetic rewrites that turned them into something alien. The sovereignty had spent considerable intelligence resources expecting those things, monitoring for those research programs prepared to counter them. Fenrir was something smarter, and, in its way, more terrible. It took what humans already were, what 200,000 years of evolution on a death world had built into the base code of the species, and simply removed the limiters. The pain governors that kept human bodies from destroying themselves in moments of extreme physical stress. The psychological self-preservation reflexes that caused hesitation under fire. The unconscious perceptual filters that shielded the conscious mind from the full reality of violence in order to prevent psychological collapse. The stress response suppression systems that biology had installed because sustained full threat response would burn a normal human body out in hours. Fenrir didn't remove these things carelessly. That was the first program, the failed one, the one shut down by ethics committees. The second program, the real one, spent 4 years building replacements first. New load-bearing structures for the nervous system. New metabolic pathways. New psychological architectures that weren't safer or more comfortable than the originals, just more functional under conditions that would destroy the originals. The result after a full augmentation cycle was a human being who experienced combat the way a surgeon experienced a complex operation, fully present, fully engaged, the danger and chaos and noise organizing itself in their perception into something workable rather than something overwhelming. They were still mortal, still flesh and blood, still killable by sufficient application of force, but they did not flinch. They did not freeze. They did not run. They did not stop. The Sovereignty had never encountered anything that didn't stop. The first Echo operational unit, designation Reaper Actual, consisted of 12 individuals. They deployed against Sovereignty Garrison Station Meridian, an installation that had, 6 months prior, overseen the orbital bombardment of the human colony on Callaway's world, population 340,000. The garrison had a complement of 4,000 soldiers and was considered, by sovereignty standards, sufficiently garrisoned against any plausible human attack. The pre-mission analysis had estimated a 97.3% probability of mission failure with 100% projected unit casualties. Reaper Actual went in at 0200 hours. They came out at 0347, all 12 of them. The garrison station recorded its final log entry at 0312. When Sovereignty rescue teams arrived 48 hours later, they found the station intact. No external damage. Every system still technically operational. 4,000 soldiers, all physically unharmed, all in their own quarters, all with the same expression. Eyes open, very still, not responding to external stimuli. Every single one of them had been awake when it happened. None of them had fired a shot. The Sovereignty's psychological analysis report ran to 900 pages and reached only one firm conclusion. Whatever the garrison had seen, they had decided, collectively, and without communication, that the correct response was to become very small and very still and wait for it to be over. The term that entered Sovereignty intelligence files that day was the term their xenopsychologists had borrowed from human literature, never expecting to use it clinically. Prey response. 4,000 soldiers of the most powerful military empire in the known galaxy had experienced prey response to 12 humans. The Sovereignty had laughed when they read it. Most of the senior command staff. An embarrassing, undignified laughter of disbelief. The kind that came before a very large and very serious recalibration of assumptions. That recalibration was happening now. It was happening 47 installations later, in a war room on the unbroken Dominion, with Admiral Varun listening to laughter in an 11-second recording and feeling something cold settling into the spaces between his certainties. It was happening too late. Echo Sergeant Dara Nas had been killing Sovereignty soldiers for 6 weeks and had begun to notice something that she found, professionally, interesting. They aimed at center mass. Always. It was tactically sound, of course. Against most species, against humans before Fenrir, a center mass hit was functionally terminal in a combat scenario. You didn't need to kill immediately, you needed to stop. Center mass hits stopped. They interrupted the target's ability to continue advancing, even if death came later. The problem Nas had discovered was that she didn't stop, not because center mass hits didn't hurt. They hurt enormously. Fenrir had not removed pain. It had reclassified it. Her nervous system still reported the information: this is damage, this will kill you eventually, attend to this. It simply no longer had the authority to override her operational intent on the basis of that information alone. Pain was data. Data was processed. Processing did not require halting. She had taken 4 center mass hits in the last engagement and had continued advancing for 11 minutes before the mission was complete, and she had the opportunity to sit down and be unconscious for a while. The medical team had used words like extraordinary tissue response and we genuinely do not understand why you are alive. And she had nodded politely, and asked when she could be cleared for the next operation. The answer had been 6 days, which she had spent doing things that could loosely be described as resting. Now she stood in the drop bay of the Ghost Runner, the Resistance's most advanced stealth insertion craft, with 11 other Echoes, a full fresh unit, Reaper 7, and looked at the mission dossier on the screen in front of her. The target was the unbroken Dominion. Not a station, not a garrison, not a secondary installation or a supply depot or a communications relay. Admiral Keth Varun's personal flagship, the command nerve center for the entire sovereignty campaign against what remained of organized human resistance. 60 years of victories, 40 years of systematic atrocity, and one old man who had spent his entire adult life architecting the near extinction of her species. "This is ambitious," said Echo Corporal Jin Marrow, reading the same dossier beside her. He said it with the tone of a man who considered ambitious to be a neutral descriptor, neither positive nor negative, simply a property of a thing. "The Council believes taking Varun will fracture the campaign command structure," Nas said. "The sovereignty operates on centralized authority. Varun has been the center for 6 decades. The next generation of commanders hasn't been seasoned for independent theater-level decision-making. And if they're wrong about that," Nas considered, "then we will have still boarded the sovereignty's flagship and removed their most experienced admiral, which seems like a reasonable outcome regardless." Marrow nodded slowly. "I have no objections to the mission." None of them did. This was another thing Nas had observed about Echoes, the absence of the particular kind of objection that came from the part of the brain that was trying to avoid dying. They all understood they could die. They simply didn't let that understanding participate in the planning process. Death was an outcome. Outcomes were evaluated for probability, not avoided for emotional reasons. The drop bay doors opened. The void between ships was 3,000 kilometers of absolute darkness. Nas stepped forward. Aboard the unbroken Dominion, Admiral Varun was building a cage. He had spent 4 hours with his intelligence staff constructing what he believed was an airtight operational picture. The new human units, the Echoes, his analysts were now calling them, because the name appeared in intercepted human communications, and it seemed important to use the correct terminology, operated in small groups, favored darkness and confusion, and demonstrated an apparent preference for close-range engagement over ranged combat. This last point was significant. It was also, Varun had decided, their one exploitable weakness. They could not be stopped. But they could, he theorized, be contained. If you could not halt an advancing unit, you could perhaps construct an environment in which advancing became irrelevant, a target so heavily layered with defensive positions, overlapping fields of fire, redundant systems, and sheer overwhelming force that even a unit that could not be stopped could not reach anything vital before being rendered non-operational by accumulated damage. He had tripled the guard complement aboard the unbroken Dominion. He had reconfigured the internal layout, filling corridors with automated defense systems and seal-capable blast doors. He had moved his own quarters to the most interior section of the flagship, surrounded by 5 concentric rings of security. He was, he believed, ready. What he had not accounted for was that the Echoes already knew all of this. Fenrir had a second component, less discussed than the physical augmentation, a psychological processing enhancement that the project's lead scientist, Dr. Yuna Sato, called deep environmental cognition. In ordinary terms, it meant that an Echo in an unfamiliar environment built an accurate 3-dimensional map of that environment faster than should have been humanly possible, synthesizing visual data, sound, air pressure changes, the micro-vibrations that moved through floors and walls, the behavioral patterns of people who had spent years in a space and moved through it with the unthinking familiarity of the habitual. Within 10 minutes of breaching the unbroken Dominion's outer hull, Nas knew where the heaviest concentrations of guards were. Not from intelligence briefings, from listening to the ship. She rerouted accordingly. The 5 rings of security around Varun's quarters were real and formidable, and exactly as described in the intelligence package they'd been given. Reaper 7 went around all of them, not through. Around. Maintenance tunnels, atmosphere exchange conduits, the cramped service infrastructure that the flagship's designers had built for small, automated drones, and which none of them had ever imagined would be navigated by human beings, because human beings were not supposed to fit in those spaces, not supposed to tolerate those conditions, not supposed to move at speed through darkness in a ship actively hunting them with every sensor and weapon it could bring to bear. Supposed to and didn't were two different things. Varun heard them before the alarms did. He was not a man who startled easily. 60 years of war had installed in him a calm that many subordinates had mistaken for coldness. He sat behind his command desk in the most protected room on the most powerful ship in his fleet, and he heard a sound. A small sound. A human sound. The sound of someone breathing. And he knew, with the complete certainty of a man who has just understood something he should have understood much earlier, that the cage had not worked. The wall panel to his left opened. Nas came through it. She was not running. She was walking with the precise, unhurried movement of someone who had all the time they needed and knew exactly where everything was. She was bleeding from 3 separate wounds. None of the wounds appeared to be slowing her down. Behind her came Mero, and behind Mero came the rest of Reaper 7, filing out of the maintenance conduit with the calm efficiency of people completing a routine task. Varun reached for the command console. "That will alert the bridge," Nas said. "Your bridge crew will come. They will find a room full of people who will harm them if they enter. Please don't bring them into this." Her voice was calm, conversational. This was somehow, Varun found, the worst part. She was not here to perform anything. She was simply here. He took his hand off the console. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You laughed," Varun said finally. "On the recording. From Kepler Station. One of your soldiers was laughing." Nas thought for a moment. "Corporal Tesh," she said. He laughed because he'd just remembered something his daughter said to him, before Calloway's world. The name landed in the room like a dropped weapon. Varun said nothing. "He said it was funny," Nas continued, "that the thing she'd said was about being brave. She was 6 years old. He'd been worried about her first day at a new school and she'd told him. He said she was very serious about it. That being scared was fine, but that being scared didn't mean you stopped." She paused. He thought it was funny that she was right, in a combat context, that a 6-year-old had figured it out. The silence lasted a long time. "What happens now?" Varun asked. Nayas looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has already decided on all the things that needed deciding. "Now," she said, "you're going to end this war." The Sovereignty's Senior Command Council met in emergency session for the first time in 30 years. It had last convened to celebrate the fall of humanity's primary defense fleet at the Battle of Meridian Gap, a celebration that had gone on for 3 days. The session now convening bore no resemblance to that one. The 16 beings who took their seats around the grand table of the Council Spire on Sovereignty Prime did so in the particular silence of people who have recently learned something they cannot unlearn, and have not yet decided how to arrange themselves around that knowledge. Varun's transmission had arrived 6 hours ago. He had sent it himself, unencrypted, on a frequency every inhabited system in a 30-light-year radius could receive. He had stated, in the clipped formal language of Sovereignty military protocol, that he was transmitting under duress, that the duress was self-explanatory, and that he had 2 items to communicate. The first was that he wished to negotiate a cessation of hostilities. The second was a data package. 47 files, each one a detailed record of Sovereignty installation's final hours. Everything the intelligence apparatus had collected, organized into a single comprehensive picture of what the echoes were, what they had demonstrated they could do, and what the current trajectory of the conflict suggested would happen if the Sovereignty did not negotiate. The data package was not framed as a threat. It was framed as information. This somehow made it worse. High Consul Drivan studied the files with the attention of a man who had governed the most powerful empire in the known galaxy for 42 years, and who had never, in those 42 years, been presented with a scenario for which his training had not prepared him. He was presenting the files with the attention of a man who was beginning to suspect his training had been, in one very specific regard, catastrophically incomplete. "How many of these units do they have?" he asked. Sovereignty. Intelligence Director Morvath consulted his notes. Current confirmed deployments suggest between 90 and 140 active operatives, possibly more. Our ability to track them is, as the files demonstrate, limited. And each unit of 12 can... Yes. The word landed before the question was finished. Morvath had clearly been anticipating it. If they continue deployment at the current rate, he continued, and if our analysts' models are accurate, they will have sufficient operational capacity to conduct simultaneous actions against all primary sovereignty military installations within... He paused. The pause was long. 9 months. No one spoke. Dravan set down his files. He folded his hands on the grand table in the gesture that in 600 years of sovereignty history had preceded 47 declarations of war and had never, not once, preceded anything else. He looked around the table at the greatest military and political minds his civilization had produced. "We won," he said finally. "We won this war, conclusively. We won it a dozen times over, by any reasonable measurement." He paused. What happened? Morvath hesitated. This was a man who did not hesitate. "They didn't stop," he said. Dravan waited. "That is the entirety of the analysis," Morvath said. "Every model we built assumed a breaking point. Every strategy we employed was designed to create or exploit a breaking point. Species break. It is a universal military constant. Sufficient attrition, sufficient destruction of infrastructure, sufficient demonstration of force disparity, and an organized resistance fractures. The mathematics are sound. They have always been sound." He set his own files down. Humans did not fracture. They did not break. After 112 years of systematic destruction, they built something worse. Not in response to the pressure, because of it. The pressure did not weaken them. It produced... He searched for the word. It produced this. He gestured at the files, at the 47 craters, the 4,000 soldiers who had experienced prey response, the 11-second recording of a man laughing in a burning room because his daughter had been right. Dravan looked at the gesture. "I am going to ask you something," he said to Morvath, "and I want a truthful answer, not a diplomatic one, not an optimistic one. Yes, High Consul, if we do not negotiate, if we choose to continue, can we win?" Morvath was quiet for a long time. "We can produce more units," he said. "We can increase defensive protocols. We can modify tactics. We can adapt." He picked up his stylus and set it down again. "We have every material advantage. We have always had every material advantage." "That is not the answer I asked for." Another silence. "No," Morvath said. "I do not believe we can win. Not because of their numbers or their technology or any conventional military metric." He looked at the files. "Because they have learned something. Their soldiers have learned it, and their civilians have learned it, and I believe their children are learning it from the cradle." He stopped. "They have learned that being afraid does not mean you stop, and I do not know how to build a weapon against a species that has made that discovery." The session lasted another 4 hours. When it ended, the Sovereignty sent an encrypted communication on a secure diplomatic channel to the coordinates Varun had specified. The message was 2 words: "We yield." Mara Voss received the transmission in the same room where she had opened Project Fenrir. The facility had not moved in 2 months, an unprecedented length of time that had gradually stopped feeling like a security risk and had started feeling, tentatively, like something that might be called a home. People had started bringing personal items. Someone had put a plant in the corridor near the main entrance. Someone else had, apparently, begun cooking actual food rather than survival rations in the small kitchen on sub-level 2, because the facility smelled, faintly but unmistakably, of something warm and seasoned. Voss read the 2 words 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor, which was not something she had done in a professional context before, and pressed her back against the wall, and breathed. The assistant director, a young man named Carver, who had been with the Resistance for 4 years and had never known a version of his life that wasn't at war, stood in the doorway and watched her. "Is it over?" he asked. Voss looked at the message on the screen. 2 words. The weight of 112 years. The weight of Calloway's world and 46 other installations, and every name on every casualty report she had ever read, and every decision she had made in the small room with bad lighting. "It's over," she said. Carver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the puzzled sincerity of someone working something out, "What do we do now?" It was such an honest question that Voss laughed. Not the way Corporal Tesh had laughed in a burning room, not that bright, terrible, transcendent thing, but the way someone laughs when they have just realized that on the other side of the worst thing they could imagine there is something unexpected. There is just life. Plain, complicated, ordinary life. Waiting, as it always had been. Patient. "We go home," she said. The terms of the cessation were negotiated over 18 months and were, by any historical standard, extraordinary. The sovereignty had never surrendered, had never been required to acknowledge the full scope of anything it had done. The concept of accountability as a binding legal framework was genuinely alien to its political architecture, not because its people were incapable of moral reasoning, but because the architecture had never needed to accommodate it before. It needed to now. The echoes were present for every session of the negotiations, not as a threat. Their existence was not mentioned, their capabilities were not displayed, but simply as people, sitting in the room, listening. Some of them bearing visible scars from engagements that had produced the 47 craters, and the shift in the sovereignty's fundamental understanding of what they were dealing with. Their presence was very quiet and very complete, and it communicated without words everything that needed to be communicated. The sovereignty negotiators did not forget what they were negotiating with. They did not forget that the people across the table from them had spent years learning to walk through fire without stopping. The terms were accepted in full. Dara stood on a hill on a planet that had no name yet, a colony world, newly granted part of the settlement terms, and watched the sun come up. It was a yellow sun, not unlike Earth's, and the sky was doing something extraordinary in the early light, going through 5 different shades of amber and copper and finally settling into a blue so clear and deep, it seemed to have no ceiling. Mara was sitting 10 meters away doing nothing in particular. A significant portion of Reaper 7 was scattered across the hillside in various configurations of rest, which was something they were all learning to do again with varying degrees of success. "What are you thinking?" Marrow asked. Nas considered. She was thinking about a 6-year-old girl's face that she had never seen, in a photograph she had never been shown, on a world that was now a crater. She was thinking about an 11-second recording and a man who had laughed because his daughter had told him that being scared was fine, but it didn't mean you stopped. She was thinking that Tesh had been right, that the girl had been right, that it was, in fact, very simple, so simple that a 6-year-old had understood it, and that the simplest things were sometimes the ones that broke the longest wars. "I'm thinking it's a nice planet," she said. Marrow looked at the sky. "It is," he agreed. "It really is." The sun continued to rise. Behind them, on a hillside on a world that had no name yet but would have one soon, they'd been talking about names, arguing about names, the way people argued when they were home and had the luxury of arguing about something that didn't involve dying. The rest of the echoes began gradually to wake. The galaxy was not fixed. Would not be, not quickly, not after 112 years. There would be complications and violations and tests of the terms and years of difficult, unglamorous, necessary work. There would be nights when it didn't feel like it was over. But the sovereignty knew now what it had not known before. It knew what happened when it pushed humanity far enough for long enough. It knew the sound a human made when they walked through fire. And it knew above all else the thing that had broken its certainty more completely than any weapon, that somewhere in the engineering of humanity, in the deep code, the ancient architecture, the 200,000 years of survival on a world that had tried consistently and creatively to kill them, there was something that simply did not stop. It had taken the galaxy 112 years and 47 craters and one 11-second recording to understand that. It would not forget. Neither would the stars. The colony ship Ardent Hope drifted through the Kepler expanse like a sleeping heartbeat, slow, warm, full of life. It was not a military vessel. It carried no cannons, no rail drivers, no shielded battle plating along its hull. What it carried was far more precious, far more fragile. 431 children, ages 3 to 16, the sons and daughters of the Meridian Colony Project. Children who had never seen Earth, who had grown up between the stars, who knew the smell of recycled air as intimately as any prairie wind. They were being transferred to Helix Station, a grand academic hub at the edge of Dominion space, where they would receive the finest education in 7-star systems. Their parents had wept at the departure dock, proud weeping, hopeful weeping. That was 6 days ago. On the bridge of the Ardent Hope, Captain Mara Solis reviewed the navigation logs for the 14th time that morning. Something had been bothering her since they crossed into the Velcathari corridor, a stretch of space technically classified as neutral territory, though everyone in the shipping lanes knew the Velcath considered it theirs by birthright. She'd filed the appropriate transit permits. She'd paid the corridor tax, 3 times the standard rate, as required for human vessels. She'd even transmitted the ceremonial greeting sequence that Velcath diplomacy demanded. 7 pulses of amber light, followed by complete radio silence for 60 seconds. She had done everything right. Which was why the 3 Velcath warships appearing on her radar at 0413 hours felt like a thunderclap on a clear day. "They're not responding to hails," her comms officer, Lieutenant Davin Marsh, said. His voice was careful, controlled. "I've tried all 7 registered Velcath diplomatic frequencies. Try the emergency band." "Tried it, Captain. Nothing." Mara stared at the tactical display. 3 Velcath Spineclaw-class destroyers, each one 3 times the mass of the Ardent Hope, had arranged themselves in a triangular formation directly across their flight path. It was a blockade posture. It was also, she knew from her years in deep space transit, a hunting posture. "Wake the children's supervisors," she said quietly. "Tell them to keep everyone calm and in their quarters. Do not—" She paused, steadying her voice. "Do not tell the children anything yet." The next 40 minutes unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The Velcath ship sent no warning, no ultimatum, no demand. They simply opened fire. Not at the hull, not at the engines. They fired with surgical, deliberate precision at the Ardent Hope's communications array first, shearing it clean off in a single blast that rocked the ship like a toy in a tide. Then the port thrusters, then the emergency beacon housing. One by one, every system that could call for help was targeted and destroyed with the kind of methodical patience that spoke not of battle rage, but of a plan long rehearsed. Mara had time to send one message. She screamed it into the emergency subspace burst, an old low-tech channel that didn't route through the primary array. It was slow, it was ugly. It would take hours to reach anyone, but it was all she had. "Ardent Hope to any vessel. We are under attack in the Velcathari corridor. Civilian ship, 431 children aboard. We are." The subspace transmitter went dark. What happened next aboard the Ardent Hope was recorded only by the ship's internal black box logs. Logs that would later be retrieved, reviewed, and entered into the permanent record of the Galactic Tribunal. Every sound, every scream, every desperate attempt by the crew to shield the children in the deepest compartments of the ship. It took the Velcath 47 minutes to finish. When their warships finally peeled away from the wreckage and vanished back into the dark, the Ardent Hope was no longer a ship. It was a cooling graveyard of bent metal and silence, tumbling slowly through the corridor like a broken toy discarded by a child too large for this galaxy. 431 children. None survived. Back on Helix Station, a supervisor named Councilwoman Preth Veldara of the Velcath delegation was drinking her morning tea when the news arrived. She read the preliminary report twice. Then she set down her cup very carefully, smoothed her robes, and sent a single-line encrypted message to the Velcath High Command. "Confirmed. The package has been delivered." She did not know, none of them knew, what had just been awakened. Because the subspace burst, moving at its slow, grinding speed through the dark, had already reached its first receiver. It had reached Fleet Admiral Jonas Kael, and Jonas Kael had children of his own. Fleet Admiral Jonas Kael, Received the subspace burst at 0611 hours aboard the UHNS Sovereign Wrath, the flagship of humanity's 7th Deep Space Fleet, currently on routine patrol near the Belthian Reach. He read it standing up. His communications officer, a young ensign named Reyes, had printed it on a physical slip of paper, old protocol for emergency subspace bursts, and handed it to the Admiral without a word. Reyes had read it first. He'd had to. Standard security procedure. And his hands, the Admiral noticed, were shaking. Cale read it. He read it again. He set it face down on the console. For exactly 12 seconds, Fleet Admiral Jonas Cale, 32-year veteran of the United Human Navy, survivor of the Battle of Drengar's Mouth, man who had once held a collapsing bulkhead shut with his bare hands for 4 minutes while his crew evacuated, said absolutely nothing. Then he picked up the fleet-wide command channel. "This is Admiral Cale. Full battle readiness. All ships. Right now." His second-in-command, Rear Admiral Una Park, was on the bridge in 90 seconds. She took one look at his face and didn't ask questions. She simply moved to her station and began issuing the orders that turned a fleet at rest into a fleet with a purpose. Kyle sent 3 messages before his ships even finished their readiness checks. The first went to Helix Station. Confirm status of Ardent Hope. All available data. Immediate priority. The second went to the United Human Embassy in Velkath Space. Do not issue any statements. Do not take any meetings. Stand by. The third went to Earth, to the Secretary General of the Human Collective, to the Joint Chiefs, to the full Security Council. It was 4 sentences long. The Velkath Dominion has attacked and destroyed the civilian colony vessel Ardent Hope in the Velkathari corridor. 431 human children are confirmed dead. No survivors. Awaiting your orders, but advise you give them quickly. The response from Earth took 11 minutes. When it came, it was not from the Secretary General. It was from President Alara Voss herself, the first human head of state to contact a field admiral directly since the Callisto crisis 30 years ago. Her message was 6 words. "You have everything you need. Go." What followed in the next 18 hours was something that military historians would later describe with a single, haunting phrase: the quiet mobilization. There were no speeches on the news feeds, no dramatic press conferences, no grandstanding politicians standing before cameras with fire in their eyes. The human collective government went silent, deliberately, completely silent, and that silence was louder than any declaration of war. But the galaxy watched, and the galaxy saw what was moving. Every Velkath monitoring station in a 12-system radius began logging anomalies within the first 6 hours. Ship signatures, lots of them. Not the usual trickle of freighters and patrol vessels. These were warship signatures, the distinctive quantum fold distortion patterns of human military vessels jumping from their home systems in coordinated waves. The Velkath High Command received their first intelligence report at hour 7. Their chief military analyst, a 4-limbed strategist named Keth Voran, stared at the numbers for a long time before he spoke. "That cannot be correct," he said. "It is correct, High Commander," his aide replied. "We have confirmed 67 human warships in transit toward our border. The count is still climbing." Keth Voran turned to the wall-sized star map behind him, where small red indicators were blinking into existence across the sector like stars being born. "How many fleets does this represent?" 3 confirmed fleets, High Commander, possibly 4. A pause. "There are also reports of human vessels being recalled from the outer reaches in the Cygnus patrol line. They appear to be consolidating." For what purpose? Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. On the wreckage recovery vessel, Tenacious, Lieutenant Commander Faye Oduya led the team that reached the Ardent Hope at hour 14. She had volunteered for the assignment. She had not told anyone that she had a niece who had been aboard. Her team worked in silence. Recovery operations always had a kind of grim professionalism to them. The work of finding the dead was not performed with grief, because grief would make your hands shake and your vision blur, and you could not afford either when you were working in the debris field of a shattered ship. Grief came later in the dark, alone. But when Lieutenant Commander Oduya entered what remained of the Ardent Hope's primary shelter compartment, the deepest, most protected section of the ship, the one the crew had clearly tried to use as a final refuge, she stopped. The walls were covered in drawings, children's drawings, crayon and marker on the bare metal panels clearly made in those final terrible minutes when the crew had been trying to keep the children calm, when the adults had been running out of words and had handed the children drawing tools instead. Suns with faces, stick figure families, rockets, stars. A repeated motif that appeared in at least a dozen drawings, a blue-green planet with a ring of light around it. Earth, drawn by children who had never seen it, who only knew it from pictures and stories, who had drawn it in their last minutes alive because it was the most beautiful thing they could imagine. Faye Oduya stood there for a full minute. Then she took out her personal recorder and documented every single drawing, meticulously, one by one. Those images were transmitted to Fleet Admiral Kale with a single attached note. "So you don't forget what you're doing this for." Kyle had them printed and pinned to the wall of his command center. He did not take them down. At hour 18, the Velkath Dominion's ambassador to the Galactic Accord, a senior diplomat named Velsor Kwan, formally requested an emergency closed session with the Accord's Peacekeeping Council. He was told the session had already been scheduled, by the humans. He was also told, politely but with no room for ambiguity, that the human delegation would not be presenting grievances. They would be presenting evidence. The Galactic Accord's Grand Chamber had hosted 47 emergency sessions in its 200-year history. Wars, plagues, the extinction event at Morvel 4, the Syndicate collapse. Its curved walls of pale stone had absorbed every kind of catastrophe the galaxy could produce. It had never seen anything quite like this. Every seat was filled. Species that hadn't sent delegations to the Accord in decades had dispatched representatives overnight. The Velkath delegation sat in their designated arc of seats, all 11 of them, and if they had been capable of sweating, they would have been. Ambassador Velsor Kwan had prepared a defense. A careful, layered, legally intricate defense built on 3 pillars: the Ardent Hope's alleged failure to properly file corridor transit papers, a disputed interpretation of the Velkathari Sovereignty Agreement, and a suggestion, carefully worded, never quite stated outright, that the humans had been running some kind of intelligence operation using the children's vessel as cover. He never got to deliver it, because when the human delegation entered the chamber, they were led not by a diplomat. They were led by Fleet Admiral Jonas Kyle. He wore his dress uniform, every medal, every decoration. 32 years of service arranged across his chest in neat rows. He walked to the human delegation's podium and placed his hands on it and looked out at the chamber. And the chamber went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something large and patient has entered them. He did not begin with legal arguments. He pressed a button. The chamber's central holographic display, a massive sphere of light designed to show star maps and tactical displays, filled instead with a single image: the crayon drawings from the shelter compartment of the Ardent Hope. He had arranged them in a grid, all of them. Every Earth with its ring of light, every smiling sun, every stick figure family, every rocket ship with a child's name written on the side in a child's careful, imperfect handwriting. He let the chamber look at them for 60 seconds. Then he spoke. Their names, he said, were on the manifest. He touched the podium again and the drawings were replaced by a list, a long scrolling list of names, ages, and home colonies. "I'm going to read them." The Velkath ambassador began to rise. "Admiral, this is highly irregular. The Accord's proceedings require—" "Sit down," said 12 different species representatives, simultaneously. Velsor Kwan sat down. Jonas Kale began to read. It took 19 minutes. 431 names, ages, where they were born, what they liked, because Kale's team had contacted every family, and the families had sent him things. A note that said Liam loved drawing starships and wanted to be an engineer. A note that said Priya was afraid of the dark and always slept with her light on. A note that said Tomas was 6 years old, and his favorite word was why, and he asked it about everything, all the time, every single day. By the time Admiral Kale reached the 215th name, 3 non-human delegates were visibly distressed. By the 350th, the chamber was the quietest it had ever been in 200 years. At 431 he stopped. He looked up from the list. "I have documentation," he said in the same quiet, steady voice, "that proves the Velkath High Command ordered this attack. I have the encrypted message sent by Councilwoman Preth Veldara confirming the attack was deliberate, planned, and sanctioned at the highest levels of the Velkath government." He paused. "I also have 73 warships positioned at the boundary of Velkath space." The chamber erupted. Multiple delegations speaking at once. The Accord's chief arbiter hammering for order. The Velkath ambassador on his feet, shouting denials. But they were the wrong kind of denials. Too fast and too loud. The denials of a man who already knows the evidence exists and is hoping volume will serve where logic cannot. It took 4 minutes for the chamber to settle. When it did, it was because a delegation that almost never spoke had asked for the floor. The Mirathi Collective, the oldest spacefaring civilization in the Accord, a species so ancient that 3 of the galaxy's current starfaring cultures were descended from their early colonies, had not issued a formal statement in 60 years. Their representative, an elder called Sev Amarant, moved to the central speaking position with the slow, deliberate care of extreme age. When Sev Amarant spoke, every other voice in the galaxy, it sometimes seemed, stopped to listen. "We have reviewed the Admiral's evidence," the elder said. The Mirathi's translator rendered their voice as something low and resonant, like sound traveling through deep water. "It is complete. It is unambiguous. The Velkath Dominion ordered the deliberate murder of 431 non-combatant human children in neutral space." A pause of exactly 3 seconds. The Mirathi Collective formally recognizes humanity's right of full military response. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. It was the silence of a door closing that will not open again. In the Velkath Dominion's capital, the High Command had been watching the Accord session on secure feed. When Sev Amarant finished speaking, High Commander Keth Varan turned away from the display and looked at his senior staff. "How many human ships are now confirmed at our border?" he asked. His intelligence chief answered without looking up from his console. The answer was the same as the last answer, but larger now. Much larger. 91 warships, High Commander. 3 full carrier groups. Admiral Kale has also been joined by vessels from 6 allied human colony systems. A pause. And the Brithani Trade Federation has recalled its own ships from Velkath space. The Brithani? Keth Varan's voice was very quiet. "Yes, sir. They cited moral objection to continued presence in Velkath territory. Similar notices have been filed by the Tesseri Cooperative and the Lundara Compact." Keth Varan understood what that meant. It wasn't just warships gathering at his border. It was the galaxy turning its back. One by one, the trade routes closing, the diplomatic channels going cold, the slowly, methodically, inexorably tightening isolation of a civilization that had made a catastrophic mistake and was only now beginning to understand the true dimensions of what it had done. He had thought humans were like every other species, capable of being pushed, of being provoked, of having lines crossed, and then, eventually, of being managed back down. Every species could be negotiated with, delayed, redirected. Patience and politics, in Keth Varan's long experience, could outlast almost any anger. He was learning something now that he should have known before he ordered those warships into the corridor. Human grief was not a fire that burned and faded. It was a forge. The formal ultimatum was delivered at hour 71. Not by a diplomat, not through the Accord's channels. It was transmitted directly to the Velkath High Command on a military frequency by Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale from the bridge of the UHNS Sovereign Wrath, which was now positioned 14,000 kilometers from the Velkath Dominion's primary border station. It was 11 sentences long. It demanded the immediate surrender of every individual in the chain of command that had ordered and executed the attack on the Ardent Hope. It demanded full reparations to the families of every child killed. It demanded the permanent dissolution of the Velkathari Corridor sovereignty claim and its cession to the Galactic Accord as neutral administered territory. It demanded a formal public apology broadcast on every Velkath communications channel for no fewer than 30 consecutive days, and it gave the Velkath High Command 1 hour to comply. Or what? High Commander Keth Varan had reportedly asked when the message finished playing. His intelligence chief had pulled up the latest sensor data and put it on screen without a word. 91 warships, 3 carrier groups, alongside them now, and this was the part that had begun keeping the entire High Command awake at night. A growing convoy of civilian vessels, not military, not combat ships, transports, habitat modules, construction barges. The kind of fleet you built not to fight over a territory but to move into it. The humans weren't just coming to destroy. They were coming to stay. And that, somehow in a way that military might alone could never have communicated, was the thing that finally broke the High Command's certainty. You could rebuild from a defeat. You could regroup, rearm, reclaim. History was full of defeated empires that had risen again, but you could not reclaim land that was already occupied, already settled, already lived in by a species that had 431 reasons to make absolutely certain it would never, ever be moved. The emergency session of the Velkath High Command lasted 6 minutes. The formal request for negotiated surrender was transmitted at hour 71 minutes and 58 seconds. It arrived with 2 seconds to spare. Councilwoman Preth Veldara was arrested by Accord peacekeeping officers 4 hours later, along with 14 members of the Velkath military command structure. The evidence Admiral Kale had presented left no room for interpretation, and the Accord, for the first time in its history, voted unanimously to authorize extradition. The vote was 219-0. The Velkath delegation abstained. It was the closest thing to a confession the chamber had ever seen. Feoduya was not on the Sovereign Wrath when the surrender came through. She was still on the Tenacious, finishing the recovery operation on the Ardent Hope. There was still work to do, careful, quiet, necessary work. She was still in the shelter compartment when her comms unit buzzed with the news. She read it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she looked up at the wall of drawings around her. The blue-green earth with its rings of light drawn over and over again by 431 children, who had never seen it, who had only ever known the space between stars. She thought about what it meant that those drawings existed, that in the last minutes, surrounded by darkness and fear, and the sounds of their world ending, children had reached for crayons and drawn the most beautiful thing they knew. She thought that maybe that was the most human thing of all, not the warships, not the ultimatum, not the 91-ship fleet that had made an empire flinch. The drawing. The refusal to stop imagining something beautiful. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the wall, not touching the drawings, just near them, the way you stand near something precious without presuming to hold it. "We came back for you," she said quietly. "All of you. We came back." The Ardent Hope's black box recorder was recovered, and its contents entered into the permanent historical record of the Galactic Accord. The children's drawings were digitally preserved and transmitted to every species in the Accord, a gesture that Kale had authorized personally, over the objections of several of his own staff who felt it was manipulative. "Good," he'd said. "Let them be moved." The Velkathari corridor was ceded to Accord administration within 90 days. A permanent memorial beacon was placed at the coordinates where the Ardent Hope had been destroyed, a simple light, white and steady, visible on long-range sensors for 11 light-years in every direction. Its official designation in the Accord's navigation registry was clinical, bureaucratic, and easy to miss if you weren't looking. But every human pilot in the deep lanes knew what it meant. They had a different name for it. They called it the Children's Lamp. And for a generation of Velkath navigators, it became the single most carefully avoided set of coordinates in their star charts, not because of any law or treaty, but because of something simpler and older and far more durable than either. Because when you pass a light that marks the place where 431 children drew pictures of Earth in their final minutes, you feel it. Whatever you are, whatever you have done, however many light years of cold space separate you from the concept of conscience, you feel it. And you go around. The galaxy had a rule. It was not written in any treaty. It was not carved into the stone of any council chamber. It did not need to be. Every species that had ever reached the stars understood it the same way they understood gravity, not because someone explained it, but because violating it had consequences that echoed across centuries. Children did not go to war, not Veth children, with their enormous silver eyes and their bone-frail bodies that shattered under acceleration. Not Karathi young, who spent their first 40 years unable to breathe anything but their homeworld's poisoned air. Not Drenali hatchlings, not Sular cubs, not the larval forms of the Mesh Collective. None of them, ever, under any circumstances, and certainly not human children. Human children, according to the Galactic Council's most recent biological assessment, filed just 11 months before everything changed, were the softest, most fragile, most emotionally unstable juvenile organisms in the known galaxy. They cried when they were hungry. They cried when they were tired. They cried when fictional characters in their entertainment programs experienced sadness. They required constant physical contact for psychological stability. They could not regulate their own body temperature without external coverings. They choked on food regularly enough that their species had developed an emergency throat-clearing maneuver and taught it to every adult on their planet. They were, in the words of Galactic Council observer Threvaxol, who had spent 6 years embedded on Earth studying humans before filing his report, a biological miracle of survival despite themselves. That report was the last thing Threvaxol ever filed, because 11 months after it was submitted, stamped, archived, and largely ignored by the 17 senior council members who received it, an 8-year-old human girl named Mara Okafor walked barefoot into the central chamber of the Galactic High Council on Vareth Prime, past 16 armed Karathi sentinels, through 3 layers of shielded security doors that no unauthorized being had ever breached in 400 years, sat down in the Supreme Arbiter's chair, and said, in a voice that carried across the entire chamber without amplification, "I know where the Devourer fleet is going next, and if you don't listen to me in the next 10 minutes, you're all going to die." The chamber had been in the middle of a war session. 243 representatives from 61 species, all arguing about the Devourer fleet, the automated armada of ancient machines that had already consumed 3 inhabited star systems in the past 8 months. Billions dead. The council fractured. 3 member species threatening to withdraw. Entire fleets repositioned, abandoned, or destroyed in the chaos. The chamber went absolutely silent. Not because of what she said, because she was bleeding. Her left arm hung at a wrong angle. A deep laceration ran from her right temple down across her jaw. Her feet were bare and cut from what looked like broken hull plating. She was wearing a gray emergency evacuation suit, 3 sizes too large, the kind they sealed children into on ships preparing to be boarded. The kind that meant every adult around her was already dead. She looked at the 243 representatives of the galaxy's greatest civilizations, all staring at her in complete silence, and she did not cry. She pulled a cracked data tablet from inside her oversized suit with her one working arm, set it on the Supreme Arbiter's ancient stone desk, and said, "I did the math. Do you want to see it or not?" Nobody moved, and then slowly, the eldest member of the council, Ambassador Virith of the Drenali, who had served for 93 years and had seen every war, every atrocity, every miracle the galaxy had produced in nearly a century, leaned forward. "Show us," she said. What happened in the next 22 hours would be debated, studied, and taught to every species in the galaxy for the next 400 years. But to understand it, to truly understand how an 8-year-old stopped the war that should have ended civilization, you have to go back. Back to the ship. Back to the classroom. Back to the moment when Mara Okafor first looked up at a star map and asked a question that no admiral, no scientist, and no council member had thought to ask. Because it turned out the galaxy had made a mistake. Not a small one. They had looked at human children, soft, crying, fragile, needing, and they had seen weakness. They had not seen what human children do when the adults around them are failing. They had not seen what happens when a species that evolved playing develops a mind that never stops treating the universe like a puzzle. They had not seen Mara Okafor. That was about to change. The ESV Constant Horizon was not a warship. That distinction mattered enormously to its captain, Commander Adaeze Okafor, who had spent 3 years explaining it to everyone who asked. The Constant Horizon was a diplomatic logistics vessel, part supply runner, part mobile embassy, part floating school for the 47 children of council staff and diplomatic personnel who lived aboard it. It was unarmed, except for the 2-point defense cannons required by treaty for asteroid deflection. It flew under the joint flag of humanity and the Galactic Council. It was, by every convention of interstellar law, untouchable. The Devourer fleet did not observe interstellar law. The Devourer fleet did not observe anything. It was not piloted. It was not commanded. It was an ancient automated weapon system, older than most of the species currently sitting on the Galactic Council, built by a civilization so long dead that no one even remembered their name. It operated on a logic that no one had yet fully decoded. It moved through systems, consumed energy sources, converted matter into fuel, and moved on. It did not negotiate. It did not respond to hails. It did not distinguish between military and civilian targets. It did not care. 3 months before the events in the council chamber, the Constant Horizon was rerouted through the Sarathi corridor to avoid a patrol conflict between 2 rival member species. It was a bureaucratic decision made by a mid-level council logistics officer who would later not be able to live with himself. The Sarathi corridor was 17 light hours from the edge of what the council's best models predicted was the Devourer fleet's next operational zone. The models were wrong. The Devourer fleet arrived in the Sarathi corridor 14 hours after the Constant Horizon entered it. Commander Okafor had 40 seconds of warning. She spent 38 of them getting every child on the ship sealed into emergency suits and locked into the reinforced evacuation core at the ship's center. She spent 1 second telling her crew she loved them. She spent the last second opening a channel to the Galactic Council's emergency frequency and broadcasting their position. The Constant Horizon was hit by the first wave of the fleet's energy drain pulse and went dark. Not destroyed. Not yet. The Devourer fleet did not destroy things immediately. It consumed them slowly, draining power systems, stripping useful material, leaving structural shells. The ship still had atmosphere. The emergency core still had battery power. Life support would last 18 hours. The adults aboard died in the first pulse. The energy drain interacted catastrophically with the neural link implants that most of the adult crew and diplomatic staff carried. Standard issue for anyone working in multi-species communication environments. 41 adults. Gone in seconds. No warning. No pain. The medical systems later determined, but that was a cold comfort that came far too late. 47 children were left alive in the dark. The oldest was 16. His name was Taran Vasek, son of the Veth ambassador. He had grown up on starships and knew emergency protocols. He took charge immediately, efficiently, and with a quiet authority that the other children responded to. He organized watches. He rationed the emergency nutrition packs. He kept the younger ones calm. He did not, however, understand the Devourer fleet. Mara Okafor was the youngest on the ship, 8 years old, the daughter of Commander Adaeze Okafor. She had been born on a starship. She had grown up in her mother's command briefing, sitting in the corner with a datapad, quiet enough that the officers forgot she was there. She had listened to thousands of hours of navigation discussions, tactical assessments, and fleet logistics analysis before she was old enough to understand most of the words. By the time she was 6, she understood more than most people realized. By the time she was 8, her mother had started answering her questions seriously instead of redirecting them. Her mother had given her a project 3 weeks before the attack. It was meant to be an educational exercise, a way to keep Mara occupied during a long transit. Commander Okafor had pulled the Devourer fleet's full movement data from the Council's shared intelligence files and told Mara to map it, plot every confirmed position, every confirmed attack, every trajectory, make it visual. "You like puzzles," her mother had said. "This is the galaxy's hardest puzzle right now." It was the kind of thing Commander Okafor said without thinking about. A small gift of intellectual engagement to a daughter who needed it. She had not expected anything. She had not imagined, could not have imagined what Mara would find. Mara had been working on it for 18 days when the fleet arrived. She had her tablet with her in the evacuation core. She had her maps. She had her work. And in the dark, with 46 other children breathing quietly around her, and 18 hours of air remaining, and the sounds of the Devourer fleet working its way through the dead ship outside, Mara Okafor kept working, because the puzzle wasn't finished yet. And somewhere in the back of her 8-year-old mind, shaped by years of listening to her mother think out loud, was a certainty that adults seemed to have lost somewhere along the way. The pattern meant something. It always meant something. You just had to find it. Taryn found her at hour 4. He had been making his rounds, checking on each child, making sure no one was in shock, redistributing warmth blankets from the storage locker that had been cracked open in the initial impact. He came around the corner of the evacuation core's inner ring and found Mara sitting cross-legged on the floor, her cracked tablet propped against a support strut, her finger moving across the screen in slow, deliberate patterns. "You should be sleeping," he said. He was 16 and trying very hard to sound like someone in charge. "I'm thinking," she said, without looking up. "Mara, I'm thinking, Taryn." He looked at her screen. It was covered in dots, hundreds of them, color-coded, connected by thin lines in different colors. He recognized it vaguely as something to do with the fleet, but the specifics were beyond him. He was good at protocols. He was not particularly good at patterns. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, because she looked too focused to be scared, and he needed some of that energy. "It's not random," she said. "What isn't?" "The fleet." She tapped the screen. "Everyone says it doesn't have a plan, that it just moves and consumes, but it doesn't. Look." She held the tablet up toward him. He couldn't make sense of it. She lowered it again, apparently unsurprised. "It moves in a spiral. Not a perfect one, but close. It's covering ground in a specific order, like when Mom used to mop the floor on the ship. Starting from the outside and working in." Taryn stared at her. "You're comparing the most dangerous weapon system in the galaxy to mopping." "I'm comparing its movement pattern," she said patiently, in a tone that was extremely similar to her mother's, "to a systematic coverage algorithm, which mopping also uses. The comparison isn't the point." "Okay. The point is that if it's following a spiral, even an irregular one, then its next target isn't random. It's the next point in the sequence." She touched the screen again. "And the next point in the sequence is Vareth Prime." Taryn went very still. Vareth Prime was the seat of the Galactic Council, the political and symbolic heart of galactic civilization, home to 4 billion people. "Mara," he said carefully, "have you checked this?" 3 times. "Have you—" "I'm checking it a 4th time right now." He sat down next to her. Not because he fully believed her. He was 16 and she was 8, and the Council's best mathematicians and fleet tacticians had been analyzing the Devourer fleet for 8 months without reaching this conclusion. But there was something about the way she said it. Flat. Certain. No drama in it at all. The way her mother had spoken in briefings when she had already made up her mind about something and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "If you're right," he said, "we have to tell someone. We have to get out first," she said, "and I'm working on that too." She had been working on that since hour 2. The evacuation core had limited systems, but not 0 systems. Emergency beacon, disabled by the fleet's pulse, she had checked. Short-range communications, jammed, same reason. The fleet's energy drain technology worked by broadcasting a suppression field across a wide electromagnetic spectrum. Nothing was getting through it, but the suppression field had been designed to neutralize energy signatures. Weapons, drives, communications arrays. It had been designed by a civilization that had been extinct for longer than humanity had existed. It had not been designed with human children in mind. Specifically, it had not been designed to account for the fact that a diplomatic logistics vessel, carrying 47 children, would also be carrying, in the personal effects of an 8-year-old girl, a low-power shortwave radio transmitter. Handmade. A project from 6 months ago, built with parts scavenged from broken equipment with guidance from the ship's engineer, Mr. Vasconcelos, who had thought it was charming and had no idea he was participating in a future act of civilization-saving communication. The transmitter operated at a frequency so low, so outdated, so far below anything any modern civilization used for communication, that the fleet's suppression field simply didn't cover it. It was, in the most cosmic sense possible, too primitive to jam. It had a range of approximately 400 kilometers under ideal conditions. The nearest active council relay station was 11,000 kilometers away, but Mara had been thinking about that problem too. "We need to move the ship," she told Terran at hour 6. He looked at her for a long moment. "The ship has no power." "The ship has no main power," she corrected. "The emergency core has battery power, which runs the microthrusters on the evacuation pod, which aren't propulsion, they're attitude adjustment. But if we fire them in a sustained sequence instead of in correction bursts, we can generate about," she checked her tablet, "0.03 meters per second of delta V. It's not much, but over 6 hours aimed in the right direction, it moves us close enough to the relay station that my transmitter might reach." Terran did the math in his head, slowly. Then, "That uses all the battery power, life support goes with it." "Yes. We'd have maybe 2 hours of air left. 1 hour and 47 minutes at the current oxygen consumption rate." The two of them sat with that for a moment. "Either someone hears us in that time," Terran said slowly, or we tried," Mara said simply. "We still tried." He looked at her. 8 years old. Left arm broken from the impact. She'd set it herself against a support strut without saying anything about it, and he'd only noticed when he saw her wince at a particular angle. Face cut. Bare feet, because her boots had been in her room when the alert sounded. Completely calm. "Your mom trained you well," he said. Something moved across her face. Just for a second. "She trained me to solve problems," Mara said, "so I'm solving them." She picked up her tablet. "I'm going to explain the thruster sequence to you and Yenna and Dov. It'll take all 3 of you to operate the manual override from the pod bay. I need you to start in 40 minutes. Can you do that?" He nodded. She was already looking back at the screen, checking the math a 5th time. The Council Relay Station AI logged an incoming signal at 3:14 Galactic Standard Time. It almost didn't flag it. The signal was so weak, so fragmented, so archaic in its encoding, that the AI's first pass classified it as cosmic background noise and moved to archive it. Its second pass, triggered by a subroutine that scanned for any pattern consistent with organic origin signal, caught a repeat structure and escalated it to review. The third pass decoded it. It was a voice. Young. Human. Female. Speaking in Standard Galactic with a faint accent, calm and clear, repeating on a loop. "This is Mara Okafor, aboard the ESV Constant Horizon. We are located in the Sarathi corridor at these coordinates. We have 47 surviving children and approximately 1 hour 40 minutes of oxygen remaining. I have data regarding the Devourer fleet's next target. It is Verath Prime. I have the trajectory calculations. Please respond. This is Mara Okafor, aboard the ESV Constant Horizon." The relay AI escalated immediately to its highest priority flag. Within 3 minutes, the signal had reached Council Emergency Command. Within 7 minutes, a rescue fleet had been dispatched. Within 14 minutes, the first response ship had confirmed the Constant Horizon's position and was making maximum burn toward the Sarathi corridor. Within 19 minutes, 2 admirals and a Council Intelligence Director were listening to the full, looping message with expressions that none of them would later describe accurately when interviewed. Within 22 minutes, someone finally thought to send a message back. The response took 4 minutes to reach Mara's transmitter. She heard it through a static hiss, barely intelligible, and pressed the receiver against her ear hard enough to leave a mark. "ESV Constant Horizon. This is Council Emergency Command. Message received. Rescue assets en route. ETA 41 minutes. Please confirm oxygen status." Mara looked at the life support display. 1 hour and 3 minutes remaining. 41 minutes until the first ship arrived. She pressed transmit. "We'll be here," she said. Then she set the transmitter down, leaned her head back against the wall of the evacuation core, and for the first time in 14 hours closed her eyes. Around her, the children who had been awake and listening began to cry, not in despair, in relief. The kind of crying that only happens when the worst has passed and the body finally gives itself permission to feel how afraid it was. Mara did not cry, not because she wasn't afraid. She had been terrified for 14 hours. She was still terrified. The fear was a physical thing, sitting in her chest like cold metal. But she had learned from her mother that there was a time for fear and a time for function, and that the trick, the real trick, the hard one, was knowing which was which. Right now, she still had work to do. She picked up her tablet again. She had 41 minutes before the rescue ships arrived. The trajectory data needed to be organized into a format the council could actually use. She started typing. She did not go to the medical bay when the rescue ship arrived. The ship's doctor, a Veth female named Counselor Physician Arev, who had been on rescue deployments for 30 years and had seen things, tried. She tried very professionally and very firmly, and Mara listened to her with the patient expression of someone who has already decided what they're going to do and is simply waiting for the other person to finish talking. My arm needs to be set properly, Mara acknowledged, and the cuts need to be closed, I understand. Can you do that in the next 4 hours while we transit to Varith Prime? Child, you need rest. The Council is currently operating on the assumption that the Devourer fleet's next target is the Solar system, Mara said. They have repositioned 60% of their available defensive assets there. If the fleet moves on Varith Prime instead, which it will in approximately 9 days, those assets will be 17 hours out of position. 9 days is not a lot of time to reposition a fleet and evacuate 4 billion people. I need to speak to the Council. Arev stared at her. You're 8 years old. I'm aware. The Council doesn't... I broke into their chamber once already today, Mara pointed out. Set my arm, please. She did not, in fact, break in. What happened was both more complicated and more simple. The rescue ship's captain, a human named Admiral Jiran Cho, who had been in emergency deployment for 16 straight hours and had approximately 0 patients left for bureaucratic procedure, sent a direct message to the Council's duty officer that said, in its entirety, I have the child from the Constant Horizon. She has Devourer fleet trajectory data. She will only present it herself. I am bringing her to the chamber. If this is wrong, court-martial me later. The duty officer escalated. The escalation climbed. By the time the rescue ship docked at Varith Prime Station, there was a debate happening at the highest levels of Council Emergency Command about whether to allow an 8-year-old human child into the war session. The debate ended when Ambassador Virith of the Drenali, 93 years old and done with all of it, said, she survived the Sarathi corridor and got a message out with a handmade radio transmitter. The least we can do is listen to her. The doors opened. She walked barefoot because she still didn't have boots. Later, many accounts of that moment would describe her entrance as dramatic, as something orchestrated, deliberately theatrical. Those accounts were written by people who hadn't been there and were constructing a narrative. The people who were actually in the chamber described something different. They described a small child walking with the careful, deliberate steps of someone whose feet were hurt, but who wasn't going to show it. They described a broken arm in a temporary brace. They described blood that the ship's doctor hadn't fully cleaned from her jaw. They described a cracked tablet held against her chest with her good arm, and eyes that moved across the chamber like someone taking inventory of a problem space. She was not performing. She was simply present. She sat in the Supreme Arbiter's chair because it was the chair at the front of the room, and she was small and needed everyone to see her. She set the tablet on the desk. She looked at 243 representatives of 61 species, and she said what she said. I know where the Devourer fleet is going next, and if you don't listen to me in the next 10 minutes, you're all going to die. The silence that followed was absolute, and then she began to explain. She was not nervous. She had been nervous before in ordinary life, before recitals, before tests, before the times her mother had asked her to present her schoolwork to the ship's officers as practice for speaking in front of people who are smarter than you think they are. She knew what nervous felt like. This was not that. This was the feeling her mother had described once quietly, after a particularly hard docking maneuver in bad conditions. There's a point where the stakes get high enough that scared stops being useful and focus takes over. When you get there, trust it. She was there. She connected her tablet to the chamber's display system, a connection point she had identified the moment she walked in, the same universal interface port that existed in every council chamber, because it was required by the Communications Accessibility Charter of 2340 GST. The map filled the enormous display screen behind her, 300 years of data that the council already had, color-coded, trajectory-mapped, spiral-analyzed. The fleet's movement has been categorized as random, she said, because the intervals between attacks are irregular and the distances between targets don't follow obvious linear patterns. But linear patterns aren't the only kind. She walked them through it. Not quickly. Not in the rushed, defensive way of someone afraid of not being believed. In the patient, thorough way of someone who had checked it 5 times and was confident in every step. She showed them the spiral. She showed them the mathematical model. She showed them the 3 anomalies in the fleet's movement that had been classified as deviations and explained why they weren't. Why they were corrections for gravitational interference from passing stellar bodies, which the fleet was accounting for because its targeting system was more sophisticated than anyone had credited. Then the questions started. Hard ones. Technical ones. From the fleet mathematicians who had been pulled into the session by emergency summons. From the AI analysts. From the Karathi admiral who had the most tactical experience in the room and the least patience for anything that wasn't verifiable. Mara answered every question, not always quickly. Sometimes she had to check her tablet. Once she said, "I don't know, but the data should be consistent with," and then worked through it in real time, in front of the chamber, until it was. The Karathi admiral asked the same core question 3 different ways, trying to find the gap in the model. There was no gap. While managing the survival of 47 other children. Taryn managed them. I just did the math. Ambassador Virith, 93 years old, made a sound that took people a moment to identify. She was laughing. They believed her. It did not happen instantly. There was verification, independent modeling, 46 hours of the Council's best analysts stress testing every element of the spiral theory. In the end, every test confirmed it. The fleet assets were repositioned. Varith Prime's evacuation plan was activated.